race at the beginning.
He's going
He's
through.
through.
Oh, yes.
Oh, out
I don't think...
Out goes Michael Schumacher.
That didn't work.
Well, I'm very pleased and honoured to have a living legend on the 4BC Motoring Show on this particular episode. And from my own perspective, when I started motor racing, I found that there were times, even at club level, when I was just driving around the tracks and trying to be competitive at club level, I'd have this man's voice come into my helmet and it would sort of echo in my head. And I think there was always the dream of one day having him do a commentary for a race that I was actually in. And unfortunately that didn't happen because I wasn't probably good enough and the money didn't last that long. But I'm so pleased and very honoured to be able to have him join us on the show today. This man is an institution in not just motorsport in the UK, but around the world, and his fantastic career has spanned more than 50 years. He's been known, and in my view still is known, as the voice of Formula One. And of course I'm talking about none other than the legendary Murray Walker. Murray, thank you so much for joining us on the 4BC Motoring Show today.
Oh, good day to you, Russell. It's nice to be with you.
Murray, your career has just been such a I guess a wonderful ride in terms of motorsport and the people that you've met and the places that you've gone. I've had the pleasure of reading some of your autobiography, Murray Walker, unless I'm very much mistaken, is the title. But Murray, there's been so many things that have happened throughout your career. I guess for the benefit of the listeners, how did it all that start from a commentary point of view?
Well, it's a long story, Russell. I'll keep it as short as I can, but briefly, my father was a top racing motorcyclist. He was the European champion in 1928, and that was equivalent to world champion these days. He won the TT in the Isle of Man and all the continental races, and he was racing before I was born, and he raced until I was 12 years old. Mm-hmm. So all my youth and childhood was associated with my dad going away and coming back with an enormous trophy, and then going off somewhere else, and then I started going places with him. And I was in the army during the war, and when I came out of the army, I had delusions of grandeur that I would show my father how a motorcycle should really be ridden. And I started racing myself at places like Brands Hatch and Cadwell Park, but I really wasn't good enough to satisfy myself. Mm. And by now, my father had retired, and he became the editor of a magazine, and he became the BBC's motorcycle racing commentator on radio. Of course, there wasn't any television in those days. Mm. To cut a long story short, because I was very fond of my father, I wanted to be like him. I got an audition with the BBC, and it worked very well. As a result of that, in 1949, I did the British Grand Prix at Silverstone, and it all grew from that.
And Murray, your father was a great influence to you, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He was a great man, Russell, a very kind, decent, honourable man, and with a very good sense of humour. He was extremely eloquent. He had a very commanding presence. Mm. And he did an awful lot of good in his life, and he had a great deal of success in his life, so he was very much someone to look up to from my point of view. But on top of that, he was a wonderful dad. Mm.
And Murray, you obviously got to share the commentary duties with him throughout your career as well, didn't you?
Yes, from 1949 until 1962, when he died, we were the BBC's only ever father and son commentary team, and we did things like the Isle of Man TT, the Isle of Man Manx Grand Prix, the races at Silverstone and the British circuits, and we were almost telepathic. We were more like brothers of father and son, and it worked extremely well.
That chemistry in a commentary box, because I want to talk a little bit more about obviously some of the people that have been in the commentary box with you and what you've done with Formula One over such a great career. That chemistry, is that something that often I suppose happens naturally, or does it take a little bit of extra work when it's probably not a family member, I guess is what I'm trying to say?
Well, I don't think it's something that you can manufacture, Russell. It either happens or it doesn't. I mean, I had some very notable co-commentators in my career. Graham Hill, Barry Sheen, particularly, Alan Jones, of course, but particularly James Hunt, with whom I've worked for 13 years. Now, when we started off, the chemistry was pretty awful, because for all sorts of reasons, we didn't respect each other. I thought he was a drunken hooray Henry, and he thought I'd talk too much. But in the end, we got to like each other and work with each other very well.
Yeah.
On the other hand, with Martin Brundle, who I had quite a few years in the commentary box together with, we clicked immediately, and it worked extremely well. Jonathan Palmer was someone else I worked with, and that was a perfectly satisfactory relationship, but there wasn't a great chemistry between us. The best co-commentator I ever had was Martin Brundle, who is still doing it, and doing it for the BBC this year.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the, and there's been so many races that you would have done commentary for, but in Formula One, is there one race that stands out more than any other as just the best race you've done commentary for? I know that's probably a very difficult question.
Well, I don't want to sound blasé, Russell, but I've seen so many that it's difficult and so many absolutely fantastic races. And to answer your question accurately, I really need to sit down with books and remind myself about all the races I've seen, but always off the top of my head, Monaco in 1992, when Nigel Mansell was leading a race that he had never won, and in the closing stages of the race, he thought he had a puncture and came into the pits to change all four tyres and wheels, and he hadn't got a puncture at all. He just got a loose wheel nut, and if they'd tightened it up, he could have got out of the pits before Senna, who was second, had passed him, but he didn't, and Senna did pass him. And then they had about 4 laps at the end where Nigel on new tyres had caught Senna on old tyres, who was in trouble with a lack of grip. And Nigel was all over the back of him, all over the side of him, both sides of him. He would have gone over the top if he'd been able to. But Senna knew that at Monaco, if he just stayed on the racing line, it was impossible to pass, for anyone to pass him, even Nigel. And that's the way it finished, but it was an enormously exciting race. But then so was Japan in 1995, which was a 2-part race for weather reasons. And it's one that Damon Hill had to win to keep his championship hopes alive. No, 94, I'm sorry, I'm talking about, not 95. He had to win to keep his championship hopes alive. And he beat Michael Schumacher by 3 seconds, which sounds is actually quite a lot, but over a race of that length and in 2 parts, it was enormously exciting. And there have been a lot of others, and at the other end of the spectrum, of course, there was the death of Senna, which I had to commentate on live television, which was not an enjoyable experience.
I remember that race. I was watching that live in my home, just on the Gold Coast, and Senna was clearly a unique driver and a driver of a generation, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing on TV. And again, hearing your commentary over it, you knew that it was very, very serious. And it was just an enormous tragedy. And I think, it would have been, it was just not only a difficult time for the sport, but it was amazing how how big an influence Senna had globally, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, but the death of Senna in many ways was no worse a tragedy than the death of many other racing drivers, because they're all individuals. But Ayrton Senna was a god practically in Japan and in Brazil. He was a racing driver that the whole world knew about in a way that they'd never known about any individual racing driver before, because of his success, because of his charisma, and because of the reach of television. And his death had a more profound effect on the public's attitude to Formula One and Formula One itself than almost anything else I can remember.
Murray, you would have interviewed him obviously many, many times. How did he? Obviously, he was a very deep, very passionate person.
He was a charismatic personality. He was always almost a mystic in many ways. Very, very deep thinker. A God-fearing man. He felt that God rode in the cockpit with him. He was a charming personality out of the cockpit. To be honest, Russell, I didn't admire a lot of his driving tactics. Senna was ruthless in a way that very few people had been before, and not many have been since. I never actually forgave him for what he did to Prost at Japan in 1990. But he was, by whatever measure you apply, he was an outstanding personality and a truly great racing driver.